Snow squeaked under his boots and gave like old leather. The air at the camp was a knife laid along the lips, very thin, very clean, and every breath tasted of iron. Jon moved through the rows of sleeping men and banked fires and the makeshift stakes hammered into frozen ground, and the cold picked at the seams of his gloves and found the ache in his knuckles, reminding him that he had once been dead and had come back wrong and right in the same breath. Ghost padded ahead, a shadow cut out of the deeper shadow, pale as the drifted banks and yet clearer than anything in this murk. When the dire wolf turned, the eyes were a red that was almost black in the starlight. He had not wanted the camp so close to the crofters' village, but the ground and the river and the shape of the shallow hills promised what passes for advantage in the north. He could see the shape of the trap he wanted to build as plainly as if it had been drawn on a board. The trenches here, the sharpened stakes there, the shield wall braced to receive, the feint and the retreat and the tightening noose. Plans were a comfort. Plans were a lie told softly enough that men would agree to believe it together until the shouting started. "Still walking after dark like a crow?" Tormund had muttered, turning in his furs near the nearest cook fire, and Jon had half smiled because it was not a night for smiles. Davos had simply lifted his eyes, as if asking a question he would not voice, and Sansa had not looked at him at all when he went. She had been seated with her back straight by the light of a tallow candle, hands still, a line in her mouth that meant she was thinking of something she would not yet say. The river was a black ribbon frosted at its edges. Frost made lace of the sedge and stiffened the willows so their branches tapped together with a sound like the light clinks of spoons in a silent hall. Ghost's tracks were perfect ovals, crisp-edged, the only clean marks in a ground that had been scuffed to mud and then set hard by the wind. Jon knelt to test the soil by the low ridge where the crofters had once kept sheep. Even frozen, it would give if you put a stake in at the angle Davos had shown him with his hands, the old knight drawing geometry in the air and treating earth like sailcloth. He became aware of the other man when Ghost lifted his head and a line of fur rose along the spine from shoulders to haunch. Not a bolt of alarm, Ghost did not bristle for nothing, but a question. Jon rose, every movement slow so the sound of leather and wool would not carry, and peered toward the riverbank. The stranger waited among the willows, small and narrow and wrapped in muddied greens that seemed woven from the same reeds he stood among. He held no lantern and carried a spear as slender as a fishing rod, its point barbed. Eyes watched Jon from a face worn by weather, expressionless as a wet stone. The first words came out of him like something remembered. "The boy that was promised has his mother's mouth." Jon swallowed once, and the cold returned as a sudden absence in his chest. He could think of a dozen names and none of them fit this man until the spear dipped and the stranger lifted his empty hand in a motion Jon knew from another lifetime, from an old tale told by a father who had not been his father and yet had. "You'll freeze," Jon said. "Come away from the water." The stranger stepped out from the reeds with a quickness that did not disturb the frost. Ghost moved sideways to keep him in sight, and the man's eyes flicked to the red gaze and did not flinch. He stopped 3 paces off and, very carefully, went down on one knee as if the weight of his words required that posture. "I am Howland Reed," he said, "of Greywater Watch. Forgive my coming like this. I am a man who keeps to the swamps, and the swamps teach a man to go light." Jon had no breath for an answer. The name was a shape that had stood at the edge of Ned Stark's stories, a marsh-gray smudge in the corner of a winter sky. The only man who had gone with Ned south to a tower made of pale stone. The only man alive who had ever been allowed to share that story with himself. "Get up," Jon said at last, because the kneeling sat wrong with something in him, and because he needed to stop the world from tilting. "You've come a long way." Howland Reed stood. He was smaller than Jon, smaller than most men in the camp. He stood in the way of a man who has learned that standing is not the same as inviting an arrow. "I have come as long as it took me to break a promise to the truest friend I had." His voice neither wavered nor struck hard. It was as steady as the cold. "I have brought something that belongs to you, and I have brought a weight that will not leave you when I go." Ghost's ears twitched. Jon felt the old habit rise, that reflex to turn, to call for Davos, to ask the man to wait until there were witnesses and a table and a map spread between them. But the name Reed had cut a door in the night, and behind that door a memory waited that did not belong to him and yet did. The wind picked a strand of his hair free and laid it along his cheek like a breath. He heard, so clearly that for an instant the Crofters' village and its problems fell away. A young woman's voice saying "promise me," and the sound of it was not a command but a pleading, and under the pleading the soft steadiness of a thing decided. "Howland Reed," Jon said, and his own voice was hoarse. "If you have come to speak to me of my mother, do not say her name yet. Not before I can sit, and not in the open like this." They went to the lee of a tumble of stones where old fencing had once stood, out of the worst of the wind. Ghost settled in the snow with his chin on his paws, eyes on Reed. Howland untied the curious bundle he had slung high between his shoulders where the strap would stay out of the reed water. The cloth he unwrapped was not cloth but soft leather cured until it lay like fabric in his hands. Inside was a box of dark wood with a grain like ripples caught in ice, the lid jointed with such cunning that no hinge showed, only a vein of lighter wood that widened when Reed pressed his thumb along it. When the lid opened, the scent rose first, impossibly preserved, as if snow could keep a summer. A scent of crushed winter roses, sweet but not a sweet that cloyed, sweet like air made thin in high places. The box held a wreath that had once been a crown, the petals dried and made fragile as moth wings, a haze of blue that had weathered but not surrendered. Nestled against it lay a ribbon of hair turned dark as smoke by the years but gleaming still where a lock had been tied carefully with a thread of red silk. "I took this from a bed of blood," Howland said. "I stitched it round so the petals would not fall away, and I kept it. I did not bury it. I told myself I would bring it to the daughter of the man I loved like a brother when there was a day for gentleness. But I am a poor judge of days." He looked at Jon then, and a tired sympathy moved like water under ice beneath the lines of his face. "Your father asked me for a promise and I made it. I have broken fewer promises in my life than there are rivers in my home. I am breaking one now because the dead do not need our words kept as the living do." Jon reached but did not lift the wreath. For a moment his hand hovered above the dry petals, and his fingers trembled as if from a cold more absolute than the air. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Tell me." Howland's tale was not long and was longer than any night. He had a plain way of telling, sparse as a Cranagman's diet, and that made it truer. 8 had ridden south with Lord Eddard, Reed said, and 6 had fallen. Their names came like stones dropped into a well. Will, Ethan, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, and others whose faces Jon did not know and yet somehow recognized in the stubbornness of their vowels. A white tower stood in a land that was no place for a Stark, and there were 3 in white cloaks who would not yield. Reed named them Hightower and Went and Dane, and his mouth softened on the last, not from affection but from the memory of a skill too fine to be despised. Ned had made an end of it by trick and luck and something that was not luck, and afterward there had been a bed and a girl too young to die, whose eyes had opened when Reed had wet her lips, and who had held Ned Stark's wrist with a grip that barely dented the skin, and who had made him swear. "She did not say the boy's name?" Jon asked. "She did," Reed said. "She said it in a breath that left red bubbles along her teeth, and she smiled when she said it, as if she had chosen something that was both a strength and a burden." He paused, and when he spoke again it was not as if he were telling Jon. It was as if he were making the air and the frost and the river understand. "Aegon." Jon shut his eyes, and a private vertigo took him. He had known a dozen names he could wear like coats, bastard and crow and lord commander and deserter and traitor and brother, but this one did not fit anywhere. It felt like a sword laid across his back, as if he were a horse and the rider had just mounted. When he opened his eyes, the stars were the same, and Ghost was still there, and Howland Reed had not changed shape into a dream. "How can I ask the North to follow a Targaryen?" Jon said, and the bitterness of it was like a bite that had drawn blood and gone to scab in an instant. "They spit when they say that name." Howland cocked his head like a bird hearing something beneath the loam. "Ask them to follow Lyanna Stark's son, then," he said. "Ask them to follow a man who will stand between their children and the knives. Ask them to follow the proof of it that you have already bled out on snow to give." "Proof is not blood in the snow," Jon said. rougher than he had intended. Proof is names in a book and seals on a parchment. Proof is the sort of words that hold in a hall when men begin to posture. I have none. You have me, Reed said simply. I have no feasts to give them and no high title to dazzle them with. But when a man from the neck says he saw a thing, he saw it. They will not all believe. Enough will. And those who do not believe yet will see you do as you have done, and that will be enough for some more. If you set this truth among them now, it will turn like a millstone from the first. It will grind. Better that it grind outward than back on you and yours once the shouting's done. Jon breathed and saw the breath leave him as smoke. He made himself look fully at the wreath and at the strand of hair grown dark with time. For a moment the world gathered itself around those few simple things as if everything else were an argument and this was an answer. The ache of longing for a mother he had never known came and went with a steadiness that surprised him. It was not a storm. It was a tide. Come to the fire, he said at last. You'll tell it again where others can hear. He led Howland through the sleeping camp. Men stirred, some out of habit, one hand finding the hilt on reflex, some to cough in their sleep, the coughs of men who had slept out on snow too many nights. The fires near the center were kept high by the free folk. Tormund's people were like moths in that way, drawn and fed by flame, always speaking, even if only softly, as if silence could call a different kind of cold. Davos sat with his cloak around his shoulders and his hands extended over the heat, palms down, not warming them, as if reminding them what warmth would be like later. Sansa was a figure in pale wool with dark hair braided close, a raven feather caught among the strands that turned to ink at the movement of firelight. Melisandre sat a little apart, her face set as if she were reading something written on the dark inside of her own eyelids. When Jon said Reed's name, Davos's eyes narrowed only a little, which was more reaction than some men showed in battle. Sansa's quick look flicked to the wreath and then to Reed's reed spear, and then to Jon's face, which she searched and searched again. Tormund scratched at his beard and said, "Little frog man," with a kind of wry satisfaction, as if some story he had heard long ago had proven true after all. They made a place, and Reed told his tale again, exactly as he had told it by the river, only slower. He placed the wreath on a clean slab of wood that had once been a bench, and he did not touch it while he spoke. When he came to the names of the Kingsguard who had stood against Ned Stark, he named them as if he were naming avoiding marks on a map, places where feet go wrong. When he came to the girl in the bed, his tone did not change, but something else did, something that ran under the voice like a current under ice. She had a way of looking, he said, and his eyes moved to Sansa then in recognition of a kinship that was not physical. Like a person standing at a window in a high tower, not proud, not cold. I have never known the word for it. She saw far. She asked me to put this in my pack. She said, if anyone has the right to see it again, he will know what it is. Sansa's hands were still and white as small animals caught in snow. You kept this all these years, she said. I did, Reed said. And you came now. I did. Why? Davos asked softly. Reed's look took them all in and then returned to Jon. Because I have heard the songs the wind makes when it runs along your wall. They are different. Because a white raven went over my home and would not come down. Because your sister was made to run from the place she was meant to be and came to your wall like a bird with broken feathers. And because I asked my daughter in my heart where she was, and the marsh told me she was far and hale and in a cold place with someone who had been dead and came back. Because you go to ask the north to follow you into a storm, and the north will follow truth if it is given them whole. Tormund had been listening with his mouth crooked. At that he snorted. The north will follow whoever kills the bastards in the flayed man's skins, he said, and there was a kindness in naming the truth that way. But then they'll turn and start counting each other's sheep again. Melisandre's eyes gleamed beneath the hood of her cloak. The prince that was promised, she murmured, almost hungry with the words. Davos's head jerked toward her and his jaw hardened, and she lowered her gaze again like a person who has overstepped and remembers too late the pain of it. Sansa stood then. She moved with grace so practiced Jon felt the practice in his bones. She came to the bench where the wreath lay and stood to look at it from above. The wisp of hair dark as smoke brought wet to the corners of her eyes, and she blinked it away without a hand. When she faced Jon, her throat worked like a swallow had stuck in it. "You," she said, and the word had 100 other words under it, none of them spoken. "If this is true, we should not make the North hear it as if it were an apology. It shouldn't be a secret whispered in some lord's ear over a plate of meat. We should say it in the open under the sky. We should say it where the trees can hear. There's a godswood near the crofters," Davos said, as if he had known for hours and had been waiting to see if they would ask. "A poor one, young. But it'll do for vows." Reed nodded once. "The faces see what is put before them." Jon looked to Ghost, who lifted his head as if to answer. He looked back to Sansa. Her mouth was firm now. "You are our blood," she said. "If the North loves you for being father's son, then they must love you more for being my aunt's son as well. And if they hate you for being a Targaryen, let them say it to our faces. We will not give them the chance later to call us liars." "Later?" Jon asked, not able to keep a hitch of wryness out of it. "You think there will be a later if they turn away?" She did not look away. If they turn away now, they would have turned away then, after the battle, when the thing is done and too late for anyone to choose with all their heart. "I would rather see true faces now." Davos moved and the firelight ran along the small rows of scars on his fingers. "Best to call a few who matter most," he said. "Not every man with his own patch of snow. Mormont, Serwyn. Those cousins of the Hornwoods who talk by committee. We'll have them by dawn if we send now. The Umber and the Karstark are with the bastard. He won't give them up. Glover has turned his back already, but he may not be asleep to reason. My guess is he will be asleep and irritable like a bear in ice, but I've been wrong before in small matters." Tormund grunted. "And we who came through your wall and your dead will stand behind the little blue flowers and nod. We don't have gods that look at us with faces, but we know when a man means the thing he says." Melisandre said nothing, and that was her offering. They moved as if an hour were a link in a chain and they had only so many links left. Davos sent men he trusted with words worth carrying and a scrap of Howland Reed's name on each. It was a name that would pry open a few doors among those who remembered tales told when there had been more fires and fuller stores. Sansa went to change to a cloak that was the deep gray of Winterfell and another inner layer for warmth, and when she returned she had braided her hair a little differently, as if today she had asked it to be more like a helm and less like a chain. Reed sat very straight, eyes half closed, as if he were listening to the crackling of the burning wood and taking instruction from it. Jon stayed by the bench where the wreath lay and forced his hands not to touch it again. To lift it a second time would be to try to own a thing that was not for owning. He had time to wonder what Ned Stark would have made of him. He had time to think of Maester Aemon at the wall, of the old man's voice going thin and wandering when he spoke of a brother who had been a king in name and then not even a name. He thought of Sam, of Gilly and her baby, and he wanted more than he had wanted anything since waking on the table for Sam to be here with that earnest, anxious face, pushing up his spectacles and saying, "There is a right way to set this down, Jon." He thought of Bran and Arya like aches in his bones he had learned to move with, and now a fresh ache abraded him where a bruise had always been. Aegon. The name sat on his tongue like a coin he had been dared to swallow. Before dawn they went to the Godswood. It was not much. The heart tree was a thin-bellied thing that grew slow in a dry soil, the face carved shallow and plain by hands that had known the form but not the soul of it. But the eyes were red sap and they had run once and dried, and that made it as real as any old grove. Snow lay in a ragged skirt around the trunk, pure where wind had slid along it and made the snow into a smooth shining where cold light pooled. Lyanna Mormont came first, walking as if she had been tall and no wind had ever moved her. She looked at the wreath and did not blink. "My mother told me to remember that Lyanna Stark was a sword in the shape of a lady," she said, more to the tree than to anyone. "I remember it." A Serwyn cousin with a face like a hatchet's blade came. A Hornwood boy with a bit of his sister's scarf wrapped about his wrist. A tall woman from House Mormont who stood behind the girl like a shore behind a lighthouse. Men of the free folk came as well, not because the tree had anything to do with them, but because they wanted to stand where whatever it was would happen. They stood with their feet set like they were already on a slope and ready for sliding. Jon spoke, and found he had gone farther and he had thought toward believing his own mouth. He said the words Reed had said because exactness felt like the only honest thing. He did not dress the tale or trim it for ears that took insult easily. He said the names, and he said the blood, and he said the promise, and he said the name his mother had said at the end, and let himself feel the word in his mouth, not as a claim but as a fact of weather. It is snowing, it is cold, I am Aegon because a dying girl chose to say that word into the world. Reed told it again, or rather he didn't. He nodded where Jon's telling needed a nod and looked at the tree where Jon did not look, and that enough was a witness. There was a silence. It did not break because of any proclamation or loud objection. It broke when Lyanna Mormont said, in the voice of a judge at her own hall, "This is Lyanna Stark's son." She turned and fixed the small-hatched Serwyn with those steady eyes. "Do you dispute the word of Howland Reed? Do you call Ned Stark false? If you do, I will see you later by the fire." "I call no such thing," the Serwyn said, affronted into formality. He cleared his throat. "We are not Targaryens," he added, as if he needed to say the old oath to prove he was awake. "But this is a Stark's blood." "It is also dragon's blood," said the Hornwood boy, and that was honest fear peeking up as if from behind a plank. "And dragon's blood made us all scream once when we were very small and the doors blew in on the wind that came from the south. My sister says we just need a Stark who won't let the flayed men keep our children." "Here he stands," Lyanna said, and the sentence fell like a hammer into a mold. "Names matter," Davos said mildly into the tension. "And so do other things. If I may, we have a battle to fight. The bastard at Winterfell will not let us discuss the generations." The free folk followed Jon Snow. The Night's Watch followed him until they didn't, which is another matter and not for now. "I have followed men. I follow this one. He means the words he says, and when he says he will do a thing he puts his back to it until it is done or he is, and he's come back from that once already, which is a trick that's hard to top even among kings. If you want a name to shout when you put your shields together, I recommend the name you know. If you want to know what he is in his heart, I offer you what this little man in green trousers has said and what the wreath says." He gestured to the wreath, and the little worn crown seemed to stir in the soft wind as if it had heard its own name. Sansa stepped forward, and she did not stand beside Jon but very slightly before him, between him and the winter-yellow grass. "When my father brought Jon home to Winterfell, my mother told me to be kind," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I did not always obey. I am sorry for that, and I am finished with it. When I was my father's girl, I thought the world was as simple as names. In King's Landing, I learned that names are masks like any other. Jon Snow is the name my father gave my cousin to keep him safe. It was a good name, kept him alive, and he made it honorable. I will keep calling him by that name until it pleases him to ask otherwise. But I will not pretend that truth is less true because I have trained my tongue to a habit. Lyanna Stark is my aunt. Her son has come home to take back the place that was stolen from us. He will take it as Jon Snow or as Aegon Targaryen or as a nameless man who stands when others run. I will stand with him." Reed looked content then, in the way a man looks when he has unburdened and has little left to fear. The Mormont woman gave a little grunt that meant acceptance. The Serwyn made a noise and nodded as if he had swallowed down something he had been holding between his molars. The Hornwood boy looked relieved to be told what to do by a girl half his size, which was not unusual in the north. The word spread as words spread, carried by men who wanted to carry them and resented by men who wanted to keep something for themselves. By afternoon, when the snow came in a brief squall and then moved east to scour the emptiness with its capable broom, the last of the stragglers had heard. Some took comfort in the frame it gave the world. Some went away to weigh. A few tucked the new truth into their boots like a thin sliver of pain and decided to walk as if they could not feel it. But it was there, and it traveled before them into every conversation and every glance as surely as breath through a horse's nose. Ramsay Bolton, when the tidings reached him through some tube of servants and broken men, did not change shape. He laughed. He had always laughed easily. It was the one human thing in him that did not feel borrowed. He had a strip of leather in his hand and he rolled it between finger and thumb and then brought his thumb to his teeth and bit the leather as if tasting it improved his mood. He wrote a letter. He had to use a new parchment because he gripped the first too tightly and tore it when he imagined what he would write, and then he laughed again and went to find the cage with the child. When the letter came to Jon, it was almost dusk again. Davos held it as if it were something that would stain his skin. Jon read the words. They were what he had expected and worse only in that they were smaller and nearer than they ought to be. He put them down very carefully and felt as if he were setting something poisonous out of reach of a child. "He'll play with your name," Sansa said. She did not ask what the letter said. It was on her face that she had already written it out for herself and found the same words. She had grown into a person who could look through the letter into the hand that had written it and through the hand into the shape of the man who guided it as casually as a man plucks a hair from his sleeve. "That is all he knows how to do," Jon said. "He knows how to make you run toward him," Davos said. "That he knows." They went to meet Ramsay in the morning under a sky that wanted to snow and then thought better of it. The river had skinned over near the edges, and the ice clinked softly when a breeze moved through. Horses shivered. Men pulled their cloaks about them and made themselves look as if they were warmer than they were. Jon had put the wreath away because he would not make Ramsay Bolton's eyes lie on it. He wore the sword he had taken from a dead man, and the sword rode quiet as a secret against his hip. They halted where the ground lay flat as a tabletop and Ramsay brought out his ghosts. The boy was older than Jon remembered. Children grow like weeds in ruined soil. He had a length to him now, as if he had been stretched. He had the look of a deer that has learned that to breathe is to be seen and to be seen is to die. He had stark in the set of his eyes and stark in the shape of his mouth and misery in the way he stood with his arms held too close to his sides. Jon's heart beat once and once again, hard enough to crack something. He had to think of breathing as a thing he must attend to. Ramsay smiled his old, bright butcher's smile. "Cousin," he sang, putting a singer's lilt on it and making it something ugly. Or should I say, prince? He savored the word and let it hang, then laughed as if he had just discovered the most delicious variety of apple on a tree he had been passing for years. "Oh, that is rich. I must thank whoever brought you that little story. It will save me hours of work after the battle. I won't have to make up anything to keep the small folk busy with their mouths. Give me the boy and I will let you live," Jon said. It surprised him that he did not have to work to keep his voice level. Perhaps dying had taught him some small economy. Ramsay clucked his tongue. "Your father promised me your sister once. Do you remember? No? She's very forgettable, that one. You people are forever promising." He drew the word out. "Promise me, promise me, promise me." He glanced to the horns at the edges of his lines, where the Karstark cavalry sat their horses as if the beasts belonged to them and not the other way round. "Let us promise each other a good show, at least. I'm afraid your little impassioned speeches don't do much for me. But then, I never had a taste for theater." Sansa's voice cut across the space with a neatness that shut the animals up. "You are going to die tomorrow, Lord Bolton," she said, and the Lord was a glove she had turned inside out. "Sleep well." Ramsay's eyes brightened. "Lovely, really." He looked at her for a long time with a look he reserved for things he might want later and then turned away as if bored. They rode back and the wind came up for a moment and then went down again, flapping the edges of cloaks. Jon could taste a bitter under the iron on his tongue. He did not speak until the Crofters' village hove up like something conjured. He chose the words carefully and then cast them away because careful words are not truth. "He'll bring the boy between us and the line," he said. "He will," Sansa said, "and you must not run to him." He looked at her. The quiet in her face had a furious heart under it. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she asked. "Do you know what you will know when you see him fall?" "I know. I am his sister. I know what my body will do without my mind asking it." She reached out as if to touch his arm and stopped her hand as if it had hit glass and then let the hand fall. "Promise me." He smiled without amusement. "We make a business of that, our family." "We have to," she said. No one else will keep any promise that matters. If you run, you will die and we will die with you. If you hold, you will live long enough for someone else to make a mistake. He thought of the wreath he had not brought. He thought of the tiny barley husks in the crofter's planked floor and the way the wind stroked them and made a sound like a whisper too soft to decipher. "I promise," he said, and he meant it as if it were a prayer. Davos went over the positions again and again until the lines were in him like stitching. Tormund walked the trenches with a stick and knocked the frozen earth out of the points of stakes. Men wrapped their feet in rags and then wrapped the rags. Arrows were counted and counted again. Somewhere behind it all, Howland Reed slept with the ease of a man who has nothing left to decide and everything left to endure. In the last hour before dawn, Jon stood alone and let the snow find his hair and melt there to dampen it. And he put his hand on Ghost's neck and felt the warmth alive under the thick coat. The near mossy smell of the direwolf's fur was more human to him than most men's sweat. A word he did not say pressed against his teeth until he exhaled it silently. Aegon. He had not told the men to shout it. They would shout snow because habit is a species of loyalty, and because there was a comfort in that hardness of vowels that no soft southern name could match. He did not mind. Let them call him Snow until the end of the world, and he would bear it the way the hills bore the push of the wind. Truth did not care for the labels men put on it. The dawn came thin and wary. Ramsay's men assembled as if they were being poured from a dark bucket. Silent at first, and then the hum and clack of leather and iron as horseflesh moved. The flayed man flags did not flap. They hung as if any movement would look like fear, and the wind was not permitted to be above them. The Karstark sunburst came pale in the winter light. The Umber giant mocked them from a field of orange. And over all of it the knowledge that this was their own home turned against them and that the cold would keep no one safe. Ramsay sent the boy. Rickon stumbled on numb feet and held his arms too close, and his face showed nothing because it did not know what to show. Jon's vision narrowed and steadied. He felt the promise like a hard band about his chest. Sansa's eyes were a pressure at his skin. He set his breath and he let Rickon be a point in a map, and he did not move. He thought, if he is meant to live, he will fall in the one place between the arrows where there is no arrow. If he is meant to die, there will be no word I can say to the wind to call it back from him. That thought did not help him, and it did not hurt him. He held it the way he held Longclaw, not as a sickle but as a bar. Ramsay's first arrow left his bow like a thought whose conclusion had always been certain. Jon did not move. The arrow struck the ground, a neat bite of wood. The boy's breath puffed at the end of each stride. The sound of it came to Jon like a bell rung down in deep water. Another arrow, another bite of earth, another and another. On the fourth, the boy pitched forward, and his hair flew with the suddenness of the halt. Jon's hand closed on the hilt and then opened again, because a promise is a law you make for yourself when the world has none to offer. He did not run. He let the screaming in his spine rise, crest, and pass. He looked at Ramsay as a man looks at a far mountain and sees the slope that will have to be climbed or died upon. Davos's breath was a steady rasp beside him. "Now," the old knight said softly. Jon lifted his hand. The horn sounded, deep and plain, nothing like a song, and the free folk moved like a river starting down after a thaw, and the shields went up, and the arrows lifted to the sky in a cloud that was like a flock of black crows turning as one body. The Karstark cavalry shifted in their saddles like men about to sit to a meal. Under the snow, under the frost, all the small living things went on with their small living in their sleep of cold. Above them men turned to murder. Sansa sat her horse a little behind and to the left of Jon's place, dressed for winter and for being seen. Her lips moved, not in prayer. She had no gods left to whisper to, but in the shape of her promise, as if moving it again inside the mouth could keep him within it. When she turned her head, she seemed to listen to a sound far away. The ground had a feel under her horse that she had come to recognize now. The slight echo that meant hooves, many hooves, that were not the hooves in front of her. She did not look toward Peter Baelish where he might be, because you do not show a hawk a thing and then expect it not to stoop. She kept her eyes on Jon. Howland Reed stood with his reed spear planted in the frozen earth like a flag. His eyes were on the line of the far trees. His mouth was set in a line that would look like disapproval to someone who did not know what love looks like, worn to the thread and still holding. He had done what he had come to do. He had put the thing into motion. It would grind. He was not afraid of the grinding. He had lived all his life listening to the weight of the world. Ramsay smiled like a child who has just invented a game and does not know that games can end. He knocked another arrow because that was what his hands did when they were happy. He meant to write a name in the air with violence and then step through that name like a door. Jon's hand came down. The world tipped forward. Snow erupted under boots. A scream cracked open in the air and turned at once to 100 smaller screams. An arrow struck wood with a satisfying thwack. Another found meat and made a different sound, a sound that was not any language and yet said something that had been said in every tongue men ever made. Jon moved. He moved the way a man moves when he has agreed with his body in advance about what the body will be asked to do, and the body honors the bargain. He did not run crooked. He did not run toward the empty place where a brother had fallen. He ran the measured distance between his line and theirs, the sword as pale as a winter sun in his fist, ghost a white streak at his flank. He ran into the place where names do not help and promises come back to remind. He ran with a winter crown he had not worn pressed cold inside his chest and a girl's last word riding his breath unspoken, a syllable that had waited a lifetime to come up against iron and noise. The veil came at the hour agreed. Not with a trumpet or with a banner thrust up like a miracle in a tale, but with the sound the ground makes when many hooves come over it, the soft thunder that shakes cold wind free of the snow caught on low branches and brings it down in a glitter that men will remember as if a blessing fell. Sansa did not turn until the front line of their wedge had already cut through air and surprise together. When she looked, she saw gray wings and the severe shine of steel and the strange clean faces of men who had been fed too well for too long and were now eager to earn what they had been fed. She did not smile. She did not weep. She held her breath and let it out. Ramsay's smile changed shape, not to fear, not yet, but to a keen that even men like him feel when a thing they had imagined simple shows its second mouth. He lifted his hand, and the Karstark men leaned their knees into their horses with that practiced shift that means retreat. But retreat at the wrong second is another word for falling, and the snow does not care that men have lowered their eyes to avoid seeing it happen. Davos had said, "Hold," and the line held. The free folk moved as if they were a ragged sail that has found its wind after a dead calm. Jon did not look back to see if the promise held him. He did not need to. He felt it laid along his spine. He moved forward, and the first man who came within the length of his arm did not move away again under his own power. Ghost hit another at the knee and took it away from him neatly and turned and went for the throat because there is no honor in a fight for a wolf, only life and not life, and Wolf has never learned the stupidities of men. The wreath lay where Jon had left it, in a chest that might as well have been a reliquary. Howland Reed had set a hand on the lid when no one looked, as a man touches the barrel of water before he counts what he has left. In the noise of battle, it seemed impossible that anything delicate had ever existed. And yet the petals held, fragile as they were, because long ago a girl had said a word and two men had believed it and one man had carried what he had promised until the hour came when promise and need met on a piece of ground in the north.
Steel met steel.
Breath steamed. The river made a small noise under its fragile skin where ice had thinned and broke under a horse that had strayed. The gods would send up no signs because trees have no need for signs. Men moved. The sky watched. Somewhere, a raven took 3 hops along a branch and then lifted, annoyed at being disturbed and yet too curious not to circle. Jon cut and turned and felt his heart lift and drop, not in despair but in a dangerous hope, that bright hard thing that kills more men than sorrow. He kept it tight in his teeth like a strip of leather to bite on through pain. He thought of Sansa's promise and of Davos's steady hand and of Tormund's laughter given like bread, and he thought of a little blue wreath made in a place where it had not been meant to be, and he moved toward the man who had written a letter he had not needed to read to know the letters on it. He saw Ramsay then, clear in the swarm, and Ramsay saw him, and for an instant all the other men on that field moved as slowly as dust motes in a shaft of light. Jon felt the unnameable weight that was a girl's last word in his chest, and he did not smile. He did not lift his chin. He went forward, a man with many names and none, and the snow came sideways in the first wind of a new squall, each flake a small clean blade. The first clash was not a clash at all but a knitting. Men came together and what had been. Air filled with breath became a thick, close fabric of bodies where nothing flowed cleanly. The long spears Tormund's people had learned to use broke like sticks at a fair or held, and made men into pinned animals who thrashed at the end of themselves. Jon slid along the line of a shield, and the shield was there, and then it wasn't, replaced by an arm, replaced by the feel of rings in a man's hauberk under blade, the sensation only half in the hand, half in the teeth. A horse's hot panting rolled across his face in a fog of oats and rank leather and fear, and the next heartbeat put him in a cool hollow under the shadow made by the veil wedge when it carved its passage. He did not see the faces of the knights. He saw the angle of their lances, the unison of their knees, the way sound seems to shut itself away from you for a breath when a wall starts to crack and the eye anticipates the fracture. Ghost flanked him until Ghost was not there, and then Ghost was again. As if the wolf had learned to be present in two places and chose, in each instant, the one that needed a bright, wet mouth. Jon did not shout. His breath would not permit it. It came measured, like a smith working bellows, like a man in winter climbing a slope he knows and loves and hates. In the corner of his eye something tall moved with the patient inevitability of a tree walking, and when it turned and the ladder of scars showed along the ribs, he recognized one by the spareness and sadness of him. The giant's hand came down on a tangle of men and horses and pressed until the tangle became something else, became space, and the sound men made then was the sound of a badly cut cord being grabbed at by too many hands. Arrows hissed, their white breaths making momentary threads through the world. Some found shields and boards, some found meat. One found Jon's pauldron and skidded up and away to nick his throat, and heat spilled there in a thin line that the air immediately tried to lick clean. The world narrowed and widened in pulses, wide enough to take in the shape of Ramsay's center shifting back, narrowing to include the exact place where a Karstark rider's knee lay near enough to Longclaw that Jon could take it if he was willing to spend the precious fraction of his back's attention to twist and commit. He was, and the horse stuttered sideways, and the rider went with it, and then there was the smell of a man who has been made into an open house. Tormund roared somewhere, and the sound had laughter in it, and the exhaustion of all laughter. He rose above a press of men like a seal in a wave, his beard glittering with frost, and then went down again, the point of a spear churning near his ribs and missing because something of him bent at the wrong moment by luck or by a god that likes jokes. Howland Reed moved with a thin, stingy grace that would have looked comical if not for the way his spear found the gaps in armor like a woman threading a needle in a high room with good light. There was no waste in him. He did not make noise. Men fell near him and men fell because of him, and he did not turn his head at any of them. The frog spear he had brought from water slid into things dry and warm and came away steaming, reed-scented, loyal to him like a dog. On the Bolton left, the Karstark riders took their cue and came on. The veil wheeled with a smoothness that made Jon think of knives in a well-packed drawer. The first rank braced their lances for another pass. The second rank drew steel. The third rank slid to the side to cover the soft places that always open at the elbow of such maneuvers. It would have been pretty to watch from a hill. From here it meant the snow around men's boots turned to a slurry that caught ankles and made men fall in a kneeling posture that had nothing to do with prayer. Ramsay, who loved dogs and games and letters, loved patterns. He had imagined his line folding out like a book and the free folk squeezed between the covers. He had imagined the circle closing neat as a noose, the shields locking, his pikes coming in and lifting, and then the show of it. The mass of northern vermin pressed and pressed until their bones agreed to be the shape the line required. Now his book would not close, because a wedge of knights had been driven into the spine, and because the giant had torn 3 gatherings of men free with the absent-mindedness of an old man plucking burrs from a coat. He kept smiling because smiling was a habit and because he liked the taste of his own mouth in that shape. His eyes moved quick. His fingers made little counting motions, and when the counting did not yield a sum he liked, he changed the sums in his head. The Umbers had souls like axes. Small John, who was not terribly small and not very much a John, but names cling the way burrs do, bore down on Tormund with the inevitability of gravity. Steel rang on steel. Tormund slipped and recovered and slipped again. His boots sent out a spatter of pink slush that had nothing of romance in it. Small John put a shoulder into him the way you would into a door you mean to break and shouted something that was more sound than word. For a moment the lines of their strength met and held, and then Tormund did a small, ugly, beautiful thing. He brought his teeth to the meat of the other man's cheek and bit. The Umber jerked, insulted on a level below thought, and Tormund drove a knee upward, found something soft by guess and wicked experience, and as the breath went out of Small John in a grunt like a kicked dog, the wildling forced his blade up under the ribs in a motion that seemed to exhaust him completely. The Umber's eyes were a long way from his face suddenly. He went down with a look of confusion that would go on puzzling him for as long as there was any of him to puzzle. Later, men would tell the story and make Tormund's bite a jest. It was not. It was what you do when there is no other thing that will keep the air moving in and out of you. He spat blood and something else, snarled, and stood swaying in a snow that had started to fall in dry trickles. The flakes so small each carried a sliver of light in it like a shard of glass. Jon felt the shift. He had not thought of victory, not even as a wish. To wish in the moment before the gate gives is to lose your footing on the step and fall down the cellar stairs. He had thought of doing the next necessary small thing over and over for as long as the world permitted him breath. And yet the field changed character under his feet. A locked place became a place with a seam in it, and someone pulled on that seam, and the seam lengthened. He pressed where it lengthened. Longclaw sang, "If steel sings when it is asked to do exactly the work it was made for." Ghost drove a rider from his saddle and came up red from elbow to jaw, and the rider tried to remember some childhood thing for comfort and could not. Ramsay saw the seam and decided to retreat in such a way that the retreat would look like a lure. It pleased him to think he could still turn this story into one he had written. He gestured and the horns blew and he pulled his center back, neat and trim, as if the snow were only a tablecloth tested for stains. The gates of Winterfell waited behind him like a mouth. He kept his smile as he went. "Hold," Davos breathed, his hand a steadying weight at Jon's back for a moment too brief to be noticed by anyone not inside that touch. "Do not spend the men on the gate. Spend the gate on the men." They came on at a walk by the time they reached the shadow of Winterfell's walls. The great timbers of the gate were new, raw wood that had not had time to cure into its own resistance. Ramsay had men on the parapets and men at the murder holes. He had boiling oil and stones and the certainty of a boy who has never yet found a cupboard without sweets in it. Jon stood below with snow frosting his shoulders like a tired man's dignity and thought how many times his father had walked under these walls and felt safe. That thought made a space in him that was too dangerous for the moment, and he turned from it and put his attention on the giant. 1-1, he called, and his voice went up and hit stone and came down again like a child's ball thrown into a yard. The giant turned his head as if he had been woken, his eyes as mild as a cow's in that blunt, unhandsome face. "Help us," Jon said, "because sometimes the only magic is in asking, clean and unadorned." The giant put both hands upon the gate and leaned. The wood hummed, a note you felt in your knee before you heard it in your ear. The bolts strained, the iron shrieked, and a hinge gave with a sound like a bone breaking in a pig. Something heavy came down from above, oil or water or something thicker, and the giant took it. It ran over his shoulders like a lake poured over a boulder and steamed where it met flesh, and the smell turned the stomachs of men below. He did not stop. He put his forehead against the wood and pushed, and the old house of Winterfell, which had seen so much and stood to it all, another indignity worse than its burning, yielded because Winterfell is not a man and cannot choose. When the gate broke, 1-1 fell to one knee because there was no world in which he did not, and his breath roared out of him like a bellows punctured. Jon's feet went of their own accord across the threshold he had dreamed of and feared as a child. Ghost slid in at his heel as if they had been made for that motion. Ramsay stood in the yard with a short bow already bent and an arrow laid. He had his light smile on. His eyes gleamed with the sharp, hungry joy of a boy at a fair who has a pocket full of coppers and sees no end to games. Jon lifted a broken shield to meet the first arrow and felt the thunk near his wrist as the shaft buried itself. The second took the wood lower, the third higher, each neatly placed in a little upcurving line that would have been pretty drawn in ink. Jon moved toward him as if cutting water. Ramsay's jaw tightened and a little pleased crease appeared along his mouth as he reached for another arrow and found his hand short. He cast the bow aside with petulant elegance and drew his blade. It was as clean as he was. He held it as if it were something delicate offered at a feast. The fight was over before it began because Jon had in him something that had learned to be slow and not to hurry to the end of things. Not anymore. Ramsay came in quick and neat. Jon turned the edge and the point and made Ramsay's blade clink off his own, and then put his weight into a blow that drove the other man to one knee. The sound of flesh receiving a fist is always smaller than you imagine. It is a household sound, the body a household thing. He hit Ramsay and hit him again, and he did not stop when the eyes went unfocused and then rolled their whites like a horse's at a fire. He stopped when he remembered the promise he had made to Sansa, which was not about mercy but about not forgetting what was owed to whom. He looked up. The yard had become a place where men learned suddenly how small the world is, even inside walls that had seemed so large. One knelt with arrows like quills in him and half a dozen spears jutting like weeds. He looked like a boar that has entertained too many dogs. He turned his head in that slow, sad way and found Jon and the wolf, and there was the look again, a look of having done the thing asked. He exhaled. The exhale was like a door closing. "Thank you," Jon said, because it was the only thing that had any shape he could hold in his mouth. They put Ramsay in a cell he had prepared for other men. They found the boy in a room made warm for cruelty and lifted him from it with such care that it was as if he were a glass vessel the color of a little river. Sansa came to him where they laid Rickon on a table that had been used for pork. Her mouth did not move. Her hands did, and very precisely, tucking a lock of hair back from the boy's forehead as if neglect of such a gesture would mark them all as negligent. The wood of the table was scarred where knives had missed. The scars caught the light in little crescent smiles. They buried him in the crypt that had been denied them for so long. The cold down there was a kind of honesty. The stone faces looked the way stone looks when it is asked to pretend at humanity and has been given long years to think about the pretense. Jon stood before the statue of Lyanna, and the fierce, defiant girl had been given a matron's mouth by the mason because men who carve like to make time a kind of flattery. He had the wreath in his hands, cradling it as you would cradle something newly born, and the petals had the crispness of long-dried leaves and a color like a blue dusk reflected in shallow water. He set the wreath at her feet, and the brittle petals made a sound like a sigh when they settled. Howland Reed stood back, as if the moment were not his, which was true and not. Sansa stood with her gloved hands folded. She looked at the stone girl as if she were looking at a mirror hung in a room that you only pass through sometimes, not a room where you live. Candlelight moved on the stone like a memory that does not need to be told to anyone else to be real. "I would have liked to know you," Jon said to the stone, not because he believed in stone hearing, but because his throat required the words to go somewhere. "And I would have liked you to know me for what I am, not for whatever you were frightened of when you asked for that promise." Sansa's voice came out so gently that he felt it more than he heard it. "She knew what she was doing," she said, "and she knew what she couldn't do. Women in songs choose and the world obeys. Women in halls choose and the world says, 'We will see.' She found a way to make the world say yes for a little while." She turned her head. "I'm glad you are carrying it like this," she added, and he could not tell whether she meant the wreath or the name or both. They went up again because the living were making demands. The great hall had been scrubbed down once by Ramsay's new people, and it needed it again, but it would serve for the thing that must be done. Men came in with faces rubbed raw by wind and by the rubbing of hands. The women of the keep came too, in twos and threes, some with their mouths thin with old fear, some with their chins up because fear forgotten turns quickly to scorn. The Vale lords held apart with the natural ease of men whose meat has always been tender. Peter Baelish stood behind them with his smile that lives in the corners like dust, one hand tucked in his sleeve, the other hand empty and therefore dangerous. They spoke of dead, which took a long while, because the names had to be said and nodded at and tucked away in their proper places, and no one dared hurry that part. They spoke of bread and of whether the stores Ramsay had left would last through the next weeks if half the horses were butchered and the other half given to men who would go to fetch the last of the free folk from the low woods before the rivers locked. They spoke of arrows and of ironmongery and of the wall and of ravens. The ravens waited. You could feel them waiting, bone-quick creatures that want to be told what to do, even if it is only carry, carry, carry. When the practical was exhausted, or at least when it had been pushed to the edges of the day where it would rest until the next one, Lyanna Mormont stood up without looking left or right. She put her hands on the table as if it were a gunwale and she were steadying a boat in a chop. She had the rooms of Winterfell already in her eyes, as if she had been born under this roof and had never once slept elsewhere. "This is Jon Snow," she said, and the words rang because the room had heard them before and liked them. She let them hang, respected them for breathing things, and then added, "Lyanna Stark's son." She turned her head and the movement was knife-clean. "Do any here call Howland Reed liar? Do any here call Eddard Stark oathbreaker? Do any here say that a dying girl has no right to hold two men to a promise? If you do, stand up and say it. Do not shift in your chair and mutter. We do not mutter here, not when it matters." No one stood. Some looked at their hands. Peter Baelish turned his head slightly so his hair shadowed his expression, which was as good as a loud interjection. "There is still the matter of the name Targaryen," a Glover said. Robert, with the square, clean look of a man recently embarrassed by his own strong opinions. "The last of them were not friends to the north. We do not forget what dragonfire smells like, even if some of us have never had it in our noses. We do not forget what Ramsay Bolton smells like either," Tormund said helpfully from his bench, and there was a rough current of laughter because men wanted to laugh and this gave them an excuse. "And I say, if you ask me, this Snow, this Stark, this dragon man, he smells like a man I would follow into a dark hole with sharp things in it." Davos lifted a hand and the hand was enough. "If I may, names are windbreakers. They keep you from freezing and they don't change your blood. Here's what this man has been to me. A man who took the watch seriously. A man who came back from death and took being alive seriously too. A man who did not run to his brother when the bastard threw the boy into the killing ground. A man who kept his promise to his sister not to do the thing that would have killed us all. If the word Targaryen itches you, scratch it in your sleep and get up in the morning and do your work and you'll find it doesn't itch as much. If the word Stark comforts you, well and good. If no word comforts you, then look at what he does and not what anyone calls him and see if the dead care for your scruples when they come walking." Melisandre sat near a pillar and made no sound. Her eyes rested on Jon with a hunger that had learned to be humble and had not entirely succeeded. Davos's jaw went tight merely to see her and then softer because there were other things to spend a jaw on. Howland Reed stood like a small tree brought into a room and planted in a bucket. The posture of one who would like to be somewhere else and knows he must be here until the last man finishes his cup. Sansa stood. She did not need to pound the table or raise her voice to command the room. She had learned a different manner of power in halls where shouting marks you as a thing to be shunted aside. "Winterfell belongs to the Starks," she said, a statement as simple as the weather. "I am a Stark. I will hold it as its lady if you ask it of me. I will hold it for the North and for the people under its roof and for those who cannot come under this roof because their roofs are burned or their houses have been taken from them." She breathed once, and the breath was light. "Jon is my aunt's son. He is my blood. He is a man you have followed into a field when there were better places to stand. If you would ask him to sit beside me, I will not say him nay. If you would ask him to sit above me, I will not say him nay. I am finished with pride that harms us and with names that keep us small. I am finished being a thing men call girl when they mean to say I will not be consulted. I will be consulted. And I will say to you that the North is safer if we put the weight in his hands now." There was a hum then, not argument yet, the sound of men's thoughts rubbing together like wool and making small sparks. Peter Baelish lifted his head and the dust in his smile shook itself out and became an expression. He moved forward one pace and put the heel of his hand on the table as if he meant to tell it a secret. "Lady Sansa speaks truly," he said in a voice that could wrap itself in a cloak and pass as something else. "Winterfell is Hers and the north is safer under her calm hand. As for her cousin, he let the word hang and did the small, infuriating smile. I, for one, welcome any blood that ties this house to a greater destiny. Dragons once melted the south to their liking. Perhaps this dragon will content himself to burn our enemies and leave our thatches unsinged. But I would be careless of my duty if I did not remind lords here that the Vale has answered a Stark's call. The Vale's knights stand ready. The Vale's lord trusts my counsel. A flick of the eyes toward Sansa that no one missed and everyone pretended to. It would be a kindness to us all if the arrangement were made explicit, so that the mouths of men in the area would have something sweet to chew on when they begin to ask where their steel is being spent. Sansa did not look at him because she had learned that looking gives such men a kind of food. We are grateful, she said to the room, and if the words were a thing placed neatly on a plate, the plate was slid to the nearest dog rather than to the man who had reached for it. We are grateful now and will be again. Lyanna Mormont's small jaw set, as if she had joined a private battle with the urge to tell a grown man to sit and hush. Robert Glover coughed, badly hiding a smile with his hand. A Hornwood aunt whispered to her nephew and the boy nodded solemnly, as if he had been told that there will be school in winter too. Enough, an old Serwyn said at last, because rooms must always have one who says the word that lets the room choose. We talk of the same thing from different sides of the same oak. We need a head, and one that will keep thinking after dark. The girl is her father's true child, and she has earned the chair she claims. The boy is Lyanna Stark's true child, and he has earned the snow and the iron. Sit them together. Call him what you like. Call him the White Wolf if that makes the dragon sit down and behave in the men's hall. Call him the king if you must. Call her the lady. They are ours. Names move men. A murmur became a shout when it found a word to be. It was not clean in its unanimity and therefore it was true. Some shouted king in the north because their throats had learned that rhythm and because saying it made their hearts grow one size and their spines straighten. Some shouted Lady of Winterfell because the sight of Sansa standing steady put something back into them they had thought was gone. Many had space in their throats for both and did not trouble to decide which one had carried on the air. Jon did not lift his hands. He did not know what to do with his face. He wanted to say that he had taken vows and broken them and that the vows still lived in him like bits of iron in an old wound that ache when the weather changes. He wanted to say that he had been a bastard so long that the word had become a kind of spine and he did not know how to stand without it. He wanted to say that king is a word that makes men into meat in a way different from other words. He said nothing. He looked at Sansa. She inclined her head the smallest degree, as if acknowledging a private calculus worked to its end. He inclined his. It would do. If the North needed a shape to give its gratitude and its demands, let it pour those into him. He could hold them or break under them. Either way, winter would not yield. After the shouting, they went to the work, as always. Davos found Jon alone in a short corridor that looks out through a narrow arch onto a snow-choked yard where, in gentler years, chickens scratch. The old knight had in his hand a small thing, charred wood, shaped by a little girl's stubbornness into something like a stag. He held it like you hold a bird you intend to let fly but want to feel one last moment. I need to ask you to do a thing I dislike asking, Davos said, and he did not dress it. The Red Woman, she burned a child. Stannis's girl. Princess.
Shireen.
I did not know until after the smoke had time to carry it. I have been carrying it since. I have to put it down or it will crush me. It does not matter who I am. It matters the thing was done under a king's banners. It matters she stands in your hall now and watches you like you are a word she wants to place in her mouth. Jon closed his eyes. He saw a bed of fire in the air of his mind, not because he had seen that fire but because the description of it had a way of catching any man's tinder. Bring her, he said, and his voice felt tired the way bone feels tired after being asked to bear strange weight. They met in the yard. Melisandre's face gave nothing and gave everything. She had the careful look of the truly chastened and the slow resentment of the truly self-certain. Jon asked and she did not deny. Davos's words were not the howling of a wounded hound. They were steady, made intelligent by pain that had had to learn to alphabetize itself. Sansa stood to the side with her hood up. Her eyes were not kind and not vengeful, curious in a way that suggested she was taking notes for a world she might one day build herself. A world in which these choices are made at a table with bread and salt and not in a yard with breath steaming. "You saved my life," Jon said to the Red Woman when the telling and the protests and the useless anger had all been spent. "That is true. You are a murderer of a child. That is true. I am not a king in the way those in the songs are, and I have no king's justice to swing. But I cannot have you here. I will not have you here. Ride south. Do not come back. If you do, I will hang you because I am tired of not hanging the right people." The words surprised him as they left his mouth because they were so clean. They surprised him into a small sense of being something like a king. Melisandre nodded, and for an instant her eyes shone in a way that made him think she had just adjusted a piece of a puzzle to make a different picture, and that the picture pleased her more. She turned. The hem of her dress picked up a lick of muddy snow, as mortal dresses do. In the great hall that night, after men had seen to their sores and their dead and had found enough warmth to be capable of talking of anything but the way their fingers felt, Jon and Sansa sat at a long board not far from where their father had once held court. The shadows of their heads made an oval on the wood where flamelight spread and then retracted, spreading and retracting in that patient, small breath of all such rooms in winter. Peter Baelish came and made a slight bow that was not quite adequate and therefore exactly of him. "You will need more than the veil," he said in a tone of offering, not of warning. "White Harbor must be secured. The Manderleys have kitchens larger than some men's keeps, and they have ships. The ships bring grain. Grain sharps iron and wins wars." His eyes moved to Sansa and then back to Jon, making the smallest bridge of implication between them. "You will need me to persuade men who do not love you yet to teach themselves the habit. I am good at that, as you may have noticed. What do you want?" Sansa asked, not unkindly, as one asks the price of timber, simply because timber must be paid for. "What do I want?" He smiled in a way that made women at court once lift their chins and give him what they would later pretend had not been asked. "The same thing I have always wanted. To sit beside the people who matter and matter to them in the only way that counts." He let the words hang and then, because he could not help himself, turned them knife edge. "Fight the war you want to fight, your grace." And he put it toward Jon with a little grace that made the title both slight and significant. "And let me arrange the court you will need after. Or allow me to do the arranging while you make a big show of refusing the crown and discovering it on your brow all the same. That is the kind of thing men love." Jon looked at him the way he would look at a fox near a henhouse, with wary respect that never relaxes. "White Harbor," he said to Davos later when Baelish had drifted away like smoke that remembers how to be into every corner. "We need Wyman Manderley, the old fat man with the little green eyes." "He will need something to chew," Davos said, and his mouth almost smiled. "Give him meat. Give him vengeance if you have it or an excuse for it. And give him a reason to believe we will still be here when the sea freezes. I can give him this." Jon moved his hand in a small arc that took in the stone walls. "And I can give him the truth. It will be enough or not, but I'm done with building on planks laid over bog." The next days were a kind of penance and a kind of sacrament. Winterfell drank men. It drinks them alive and it drinks them dead. And when it has drunk enough, it becomes itself again, which is not cruelty but the only kind of mercy stone knows. Sansa took the measure of the place with the practicality of the women of her house. She walked the kitchens and the cellars and the rooms where grain is kept in spring and eaten in winter. She spoke to women who had served Boltons and men who had skulked and boys who had learned to put their heads down in doorways. When she smiled, it was not a weapon, and that made it more effective than any knife. She had the bedchambers scrubbed with lye, which makes a room smell like the promise of clean rather than clean itself. She had the banners changed by slow, deliberate degrees, so that each alteration felt like a correction to a thing that had been always intended to be thus and had briefly gone wrong. Jon went to the Godswood when he could, not for prayer, for which he had no talent, but to set his back against the heart tree and count his breaths until the counting became boring and his thoughts wore themselves smooth. Howland Reed came there too, once, uninvited and therefore respectfully welcome. They stood without speech a while, and the wind spoke in the thin crown of the tree, and in the dry grass, and in the little branches that knock against one another with a polite clack. "I will go back to my gray water," Reed said at last. "I have done what I came for." He looked up, and the moving of his eyes made his face look younger for that moment, the way a bird looks younger when it lifts its head because you remember they once were eggs. "I will tell my daughter I saw the North put itself into a man. She will enjoy the picture. She will tell me how it could have been done better from a tree where the bark goes soft and green in the spring." "I would have liked to speak with her," Jon said without knowing he would, and the smile that touched Howland's mouth was a thing like light underwater. "You may yet," Reed said. "The world moves like water in the marsh, slow as a thought and quick as a fish. It throws things together you would not expect. There is a thing I should tell you before I go, though perhaps your maester will tell you as well if he has the right books and the right habit of mind. I do not love fire as the Red Woman does. I love old wood. There is a kind of glass inside the old wood under the sea, if you know where to reach, that will break the cold things the way salt breaks leeches. Dragon's glass, men call it. Dragonstone is called the word for a reason that is more than the color of its cliffs. When you send ravens, send one to that rock. Tell any who will answer you that you are Lyanna Stark's son. Tell them the storm that birthed you hasn't blown itself out yet." Jon looked at the carved eyes weeping their old sap. "You mean to say there are answers in places that sound like stories?" "Yes." Reed's plainness would have been insulting from another man. "Stories are the only places there are answers for problems this old. See that you tell the story ahead of yourself rather than let it catch you from behind." Howland left that noon with 2 men as quiet as he, their reed boots tied to their saddles, their spears wrapped to keep them from complaining in the wind. He did not look back. Men who live in moving houses learn to look forward. Jon watched the broad double line of their tracks soften and fill until it was just the same old snow as before, and then he went to find Sansa in a room where the curtains had been drawn back to catch what weak sun there was, an art she had begun to practice as if she were a lensmaker. "We are sending to White Harbor," he said. "I have already written the letter," she said, and she held it up. The parchment had the weight of something argued over and honed. "I did not mention the name our aunt gave you, not because I am ashamed of it, because Wyman Manderly's pride is big enough to need feeding, and if we give him 2 meals at once, he will not taste either. First we will give him justice. The names of those that fed the Boltons, the chance to pretend his own anger is for our sake more than for his. Then we will give him solidity. The grain stores, the iron, the work we will do. Then, when his cooks have lifted his mood, we will let him have the story, and he will tell it at his board as if it were a thing he learned in his sleep and has just thought to share. He will love that." Jon laughed then, which made him feel his ribs as if they had been wrapped with worse things than leather. "You are better at this than I am," he said. "I am better at some things," she said. "You are better at others. Between us," her mouth quirked, "we make almost one good lord." He looked to the window. Outside, a dozen boys were trying to carry a log too heavy for them and failing gloriously. "Peter will try to pry us apart," he said, and there was no need to whisper it. But he lowered his voice anyway because walls have a way of telling men's words to one another when those words were born in certain mouths. "Peter will try," Sansa said. "Peter believes that a knife goes in better if the person he cuts thinks he loves them. We will let him think he is winning. That is his favorite thing in the world. Then we will make use of him and put him away when he has done the thing we require." "And what is the thing we require?" "Time," she said. "Bread. Men who can put their boots on their feet in the dark without waking their wives and children. And a quiet letter from the Vale to say that their debts to us have been paid." They sent ravens. It is a satisfaction to send many ravens at once out of small doors in cold weather, the way breath goes out of a room when a joke lands. One went to White Harbor with Sansa's letter, and one went to Bear Island with a petition more like a salute than a plea. One went to Deepwood Motte and one to Last Hearth, not because forgiveness was likely but because the North regards being asked a kind of fondness, even when it refuses the asker. One they sent south along the coast where the air smells of kelp and salt to a black-toothed rock the maps call Dragonstone. The letter for that one was written in Jon's hand, and it did not mention the name that was awkward in his mouth. It mentioned the glass that breaks ice and the way old stories are sometimes the only ones worth reading when the wolves come down from the hills. He sealed it with a twist of wax and the press of Winterfell's wolf. He did not think the sea would obey him, but he gave it something to carry anyway. In the yard they trained until the men's breathing made the air warm near the ground and then cold again when it lifted. They made spears from cart shafts and shaved spearheads from old planks and bound the heads with iron they had in buckets. They cut the shafts to lengths that fit men, short for the short, long for the long. They made humor of it so that men learned the measure of each other without rancor. "You, tall one, hold that like a broom, not like a woman," and laughter, and then the correction, and then the move repeated until the body's cleverness learned it. Sansa asked that the women of the kitchens be shown how to knot cloth to make slings. She asked that the girls be taught where a knife put in a thigh can ruin a man for the day. She asked that the old men who could no longer lift a shield be given jobs that were not called jobs. Keeping fires tended in places where young men forget fires when their blood is hot. Counting arrows. Telling boys stories that make them remember their hands are not meant only for killing. She gave each of those things a name so that each would be taken seriously. "We will have a list," she said, and people believe lists the way they believe weather, and the list itself began to make the work real. Littlefinger tried once more, very politely, to separate them. He caught Jon in a corridor where the tapestries had been taken for blankets. The bare stone looked honest and therefore dangerous. He took a breath that felt like a practiced prelude and said, "You know what Sansa is? She is Winterfell. Men follow stones and women who belong to stones because stones do not move. You are something else. You are a storm. They will love you in the field because you make them feel alive. In a hall you will frighten them because storms break roofs. Let me help you be the thing you are without breaking the roofs we have just repaired. What do you want?" Jon asked again, patient now in a way he had not known he had in him. "What is due?" Peter said. "Recognition. Access. A name few men say aloud and all men understand." He smiled. "Warden. Or if you prefer, Regent. You do the blood, I do the bone. It is how bodies move." Jon's quietness then was its own answer. "I have died once," he said. "I do not plan to hand my throat to any man while I am busy living the second time. You will sit where you are told, Peter. You will be useful. You will be thanked in the way that suits you best, by being allowed to live in the manner to which you have accustomed yourself. If you try to put a hand between me and my sister, I will cut off the hand at the wrist and give it to the dogs, and then I will find a use for the stump that suits the man you are." It was not elegant. It was not even particularly northern. It was, however, perfectly understandable. Baelish bowed the small bow he bows when he is not pleased. He went away as if he had not considered going away at all, but had thought of something else he must do. Wolves trotted in the yard and lifted their noses to judge the scent the man left behind and were not impressed and went back to their business. At night, when the house sleeps badly, the mind goes into rooms it has not looked into since childhood. Jon walked those rooms. He saw himself small in them again, awkward and grateful and hungry and proud and ashamed of being all those things at once. He saw Robb with his easy grace and his laughter and the little streak of recklessness that men mistake for courage and boys mistake for destiny. He saw Arya flitting like a knife with legs. He saw Bran at the very beginning of being too brave to be wise. He saw Sansa with her hair in perfect ribbons and her mouth practiced in saying thank you and in keeping back all the things she wished to say. He stood before the fire and put his hand near it and drew it away and then put it near again, like a man at the edge of a very cold river making himself step in, 1 inch of shin at a time. The next morning a raven came from White Harbor. Wyman Manderly's words rolled like a barrel. Complaints justified and unjustified, demands reasonable and unreasonable, and then in a turn that made Davos's mouth go sideways with the pleasure of it, a promise to come with ships as far as the ice would allow if he could have the heads of certain men and the leeway to tell a story in his hall that would make him look clever. Sansa wrote back with a neat hand that gave him both, disguised so that he could pretend to have wrung them from her. "He will like that," she said, which meant more than the sentence contained. When the raven leapt, the sudden lightness in Jon's chest made him wonder whether joy and fear share a seat and take turns speaking. Bear Island answered in the little fierce hand of Lyanna Mormont herself, as if she had already sacked her maester and taken his stool. "We will send what we have," she wrote. "It is not much, and it is enough. Tell the man with 2 names that I will call him by the one he uses when he is hungry." Jon smiled at that, warmed all out of proportion to what the words deserved. From Deepwood came a blandness that meant the Glover conscience had not entirely forgiven itself and needed time to find the shape of its apology. From Last Hearth came nothing, which was a sound too, the sound of doors being bolted from within. "Later," Davos said, not with hope but with the resignation that has outlasted worse things. On the 5th morning after the battle, Sansa went with Jon to the crypt and brought a small bundle under her cloak. They stood before Lyanna's stone, the air chill and still, the candles making a tiny brave light that reminds you that lights are not brave, only the hands that tend them are. Sansa knelt and untied the bundle, and there lay a ribbon of dark hair that was not dark by nature, like the lock in the Crannogman's box, but dark from being kept near smoke and rubbed with hands in grief. "My mother cut it," she said, "the day father brought you home. She hated the thing she had done as she did it, which is a fair description of her for much of her life." Sansa smiled sadly, and with a gentleness that had no engineer in it. "She kept it because you keep what hurts you if it is also part of what you loved. I thought, perhaps it would please you to put it here, where the old things learn to be something else." Jon took the hair. It was lighter than he expected, insubstantial in that way old keepsakes are, as if the memory is the only weight and the thing itself is merely a place to put your fingers. He laid it beside the wreath. The 2 little offerings looked right together in the way a knife and a whetstone look right together. One sharp, one meant to keep the first honest. "I used to think if I knew what I was, I would be less lonely," he said to the stone. "Now I think loneliness is weather. It passes if you put your back into a wall and wait." He set his hand to the stone's cold knee, not piously, but as a man knocks a post before he hangs his cloak to see if it will take the weight. When they went up again, snow had started in earnest. The flakes had grown fat and lazy with that particular decision the sky sometimes makes when it means to sit down and stay. The ravens turned their heads to present their good eyes to the cold. The horses stood with one leg cocked in patience. Children ran and stuck out their tongues and learned a lesson about how soft things can sting if you give them enough numbers. That night in the hall, Jon addressed them as the thing they had asked him to be. He did not stand on a dais. He stood on the same rushes they stood on, because a room is clever about such matters. "There will be time for our old fights," he said. "There will be time for the men you hate and the men you forgive. There will be food to find and men to set to plows where there are plows to set. I mean to find all of that. But before everything we must remember that what comes from the north does not care about our names any more than the sea cares what you call the man who falls into it. There is a wall. I meant to die under it and got unlucky. Now I mean for us to live under it and get lucky. We will send for glass that bites ice. We will bring in the outfarms. We will put every hand to knots and rope and nails. We will make Winterfell a place whose rooms men do not die in easily. And when the dead come, we will not act surprised." They cheered him because men cheer when they are frightened if you give them a sound to make and a breath to make it with. He let the cheer go on for as long as the room required and then let it die of its own accord, as a fire will if you do not feed it and you do not try to stamp it out too soon. After, when the hall bled away into rooms and blankets and straw pallets and dark, Sansa came to him with a piece of parchment folded into itself twice. "A raven from the south," she said. "Not from King's Landing. From Old Town, by the look of the mark." He unfolded it and found the neat, impatient hand of Samwell Tarly, who had learned to make letters sit up straight, as if that would make people take them more seriously. Sam wrote of books that had dust thicker than snow. He wrote of a thing a maester had written and then had overwritten and then had written again, about dragonglass and a place under a black stone keep where 1,000 knives lie sleeping. He wrote of White Walkers in the careful way a man writes the name of a woman who is not his wife, with respect and with a sense that the paper might burn. He wrote, "Come if you can. If you cannot, send men who can." Jon smiled without meaning it, without feeling it exactly. "A story from a man who loves them," he said softly. "The best kind." "We will need ships," Sansa said. "I'll find a way," he said. In the morning he set Davos to reckon how many men could be spared to go to the sea, and how long the roads would hold for carts that would need to return before the rivers took their bridges away. He set the smiths to cutting down the iron he had won into shapes that would hold blades of glass, and he sent a boy who ran better than other boys to the men who cast arrowheads to tell them to keep their fires low and steady and their tempering patient. He sent a quiet man with very good ears into the dormitories where the Vale Knights were quartered to listen to what the lords of the Bloody Gate said when they thought themselves among friends. The quiet man came back with the unsurprising news that some called him prince when they thought it clever, and some called him bastard when they thought it safe, and some called him both because men like the taste of their own wit. He came back also with the undelightful tidings that Peter Baelish had been heard to say, "You can't put a wolf and a dragon in one collar and expect the dog that walks them not to be dragged." Jon filed it where he filed things he might kill for later and did not kill for now. They lit braziers in the high places along the walls at dusk as if they were on parade for the sky, and the sky did not care, and that was fine. Men watched the lights and liked the look of them. It is good to remember that you can make warmth if you agree to. It is good to see a little controlled flame when the great uncontrolled cold makes a council around you. The day before the first of Manderley's men were meant to arrive with carts that would make the yard into a muddle. Jon took the wreath from the chest and went to the God's Wood with it. The flakes came steady, a hush like that which follows in a hall when the host has said the one unarguable thing. He set the wreath at the base of the heart tree, as if he were arranging a guest in a room he himself would not be staying in. He thought, "Mother," and the thought did not break him. It only made him straighten his spine, which was a different and better thing. Ghost came and leaned his heavy head against the back of Jon's knee and took his weight as if they were practicing something together. "Once," Jon said into the cold, "I thought I would be a man who belonged to no one and nothing and therefore would not be asked to stand for anyone." He smiled at himself for the simplicity of it. "I stand. I am asked. I will try not to fall." Wind went through the red carved eyes and made no change in them. The world will not lift your burden. It will hold you upright for a moment if you set your back in the right place. When he turned, Sansa stood at the edge of the clearing as if she had been there since summer. She came forward only when his breath had found a regular pace again. "Are you ready to meet Lord Manderley and be told all the things we should have done?" she asked, allowing herself somewhat more humor than any boy would have dared around their father. "I am ready to be told all the things we will do as soon as he leaves," he said, and that made her laugh out loud, a sound rare enough to make both of them look startled and then warmed by the surprise. They walked back to the keep side by side. The snow made a soft hiss under their boots. The ravens in the rookery shifted and muttered like old men in a low hall. The wolves in the kennels turned twice on their straw and lay down heavy. Somewhere a child cried and was picked up and soothed, and somewhere a man wept and did not want to be soothed, and the house took both into itself as it has always done. On the road from White Harbor, carts creaked, and men in cloaks with fish stitched at the hem sang to keep their teeth from chattering too hard. And behind them, somewhere far beyond the next bend of the world, a great black rock stood out of the sea with a keep on it shaped like a bad dream and a truth under it shaped like a good one. In Old Town, a boy who once had been afraid of the dark held a book close to a candle and hissed when a drip of wax fell on his hand and persisted anyway. In the south, the lion peered at itself in mirrors of polished metal and did not like what looked back but would not tell anyone. On the narrow sea, a woman with white hair and a crown of her own made out of the ash of a dozen cities breathed and watched and planned, and the dragons she kept tested the wind with their long clever tongues like wounded cats deciding whom to trust. She was far, and the road between far and here is full of hooks. But the ravens don't know that, and the snow does not care. Night laid its great body over Winterfell. The braziers glowed, round as eyes half closed in contentment, and the banners hung heavy, their wolves and bears and mermen not needing to move to prove themselves. Jon sat at the end of a bench with his hands slack on his knees for the first time in many days, like a man who has learned how to put his sword down without feeling he has lost it. Sansa came to sit beside him and did not speak, and they listened to the house breathe. A sound far off, the clatter of a dropped ladle, rang and died. "Do you think we were wrong?" she asked at last, not looking at him, and the question could have been about any one of a dozen choices they had made. "We will be wrong often," he said. "We will be right sometimes. We will try to make the wrong small and the right large. And when the dead come, it won't matter if we were wrong in the ways that don't matter." She nodded. She leaned her shoulder against his upper arm, the weight of it serious and comforting. It made him think of old days when Arya had flung herself against him like a cat and had not cared whether he toppled. It made him think of being a small boy and leaning his head into the heavy warm shoulder of a great dog, because that is what small boys do when they find themselves at the edge of a heat they do not understand. In his mind, for the first time, the name the dying girl had said and the name he had earned in the cold did not fight. They lay together like two bits of iron left on the anvil to cool, and he knew that tomorrow a smith would lift one in tongs and fit it to a haft or a hilt, and the tool would do the work it was meant for, and whether that work was farming or killing would have to be discovered in the doing. Snow fell. The night held. The house kept them. Outside the walls, beyond the fields and the hedge and the distance where men pretend there is safety, the wind had a sound in it like voices heard through a door. Jon stood and went to meet the first men of White Harbor at the gate, and on the stair above the yard a thin girl with a certain turn to her head. Not Sansa, not Arya, not a Stark at all, just some girl of the keep with a braid like a brown rope, looked down, saw him, and smiled in a way that said, without any words, "We will have a winter and then there will be other seasons, won't there?" And answered her own question by turning and running light along the wall, as if there would indeed be spring. He would take that. He would take any promise the house offered, even one spoken through the feet of a girl who had never read a letter from Old Town or heard a man say Dragonstone. He lifted a hand in greeting to the fat lord whose breath already steamed like a well-fed kettle, and when Wyman Manderly's little green eyes narrowed to measure him and then warmed into their private twinkle, Jon felt, absurdly and fiercely, that he had done something right without knowing which thing it was. They shook hands. The hand was soft and hard at once, like a baker's. "Your Grace," Wyman said, with the enjoyment of a man tasting a new spice. "My lady." He bowed to Sansa with a flourish that showed knees not as good as they once had been but still willing. "Let us see what we can make out of stone and snow between us, shall we? I have brought flour enough to make you think us rich and news enough to make you think us poor. Also," he lowered his voice, "a song you will clap to if I choose to sing it, though I warn you, I have a poor voice." "We will sing with you," Sansa said, and Jon thought that between them they had almost managed to make a joke again, which is the true sign of people who intend to live together through the winter. They led the fat lord in under the wolf, and the hall filled with more voices and more steam, and for a time, an hour or the space between two cups, or the breath between two properly placed nails, Winterfell felt like a place that had decided to be a home again, not only a fort. Beyond it, in the north, Rime and Night set their pieces on their boards, and high on a black-toothed rock a raven pecked at an old chain, and at the wall the white wind patted the stones affectionately, the way a wolf mother licks her cubs. Jon slept harder that night than he had since he'd died. He dreamed of a field full of snowdrops that had forced themselves up through crusted frost, white and fierce and low to the ground, their heads bowed as if in prayer, and somewhere beyond the field a sound like wings folding. When morning came, he did not speak the dream aloud. He washed. He put on the same worn, cleaned, mended coat he had worn 2 days before. He broke bread. He walked the yard. He listened when men told him the same story 3 times, because sometimes men need to hear themselves say it 3 times to be finished with it. He wrote a letter to Sam and thanked him and said, "I will come if I can, and if I cannot, I will send men whose hearts are stout and whose knees do not refuse stairs." He wrote a letter to a rock and addressed it to a dragon, and did not say that he feared the woman with white hair as he had never feared a man in armor. He wrote a letter to no one and folded it small and put it in his pocket and kept it there, because sometimes a man needs to keep a shape of words near his body to remind himself that his mouth still belongs to him. By noon, snow had thickened to a white that made the world new. He stood on the battlements with Sansa and the fat lord and the thin knight and the little bear and the man with the old scars on his fingers, and they looked out over their land and saw nothing of it, and took strength from the fact that they knew it was there anyway. Sansa's hair had gathered a fringe of frost around her temples that made her look older and more like the girl in stone beneath the house, and John had the odd feeling that he could feel Lionel's attention on them, the way you feel sun through glass on the back of your hand when you stand near a window. It was not a comfort. It was a stimulus. "Shall we begin?" Wyman said, rubbing his hands the way men rub them when they stand between cold and a problem they think they can solve with counting. And they did. They began again, as men always must, with the small things that fill a life until the large things arrive. They counted sacks and nails, they marked names, they sent boys to fetch and men to carry. They argued, they laughed, they raised their voices and lowered them. They remembered to feed the dogs and to close doors behind them. Somewhere two men put an arrowhead and a shaft together for the first time and felt, both of them, the small, righteous satisfaction of the right fit. Somewhere a woman showed a girl how to turn a hem so it would not fray in the boots. Somewhere a man stood in a doorway and decided not to say the cruel thing he had been keeping ready and went on into the room and kissed his child's hair instead. Snow fell and the light went early and the night started again, as it will do until it doesn't, and the house at Winterfell breathed and slept and woke and went on. Wolves howled, and the howling made the hairs on men's forearms stand, and men looked at one another and nodded, not because they liked the sound but because it meant the wolves were still the thing the wolves had always been. When John put his head down, he did not call himself by either of his names in his mind. He called himself by none and woke with both and found, with surprise and a kind of relief, that the two did not jostle. They lay beside one another, and he rose, and the day began.